through, but it's nice to see you all in person. I also do want to welcome Fred Chance, who's our new CTB member from Hannah Highlands. We're excited to have you join the subcommittee and look forward to also getting a chance to get you up to speed on some of the rail and transit side of our transportation house. Yeah. So before I do that, why don't we go ahead and get the minutes approved? Does anyone have a motion to approve minutes?
So moved.
Second. All right. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. So a couple of updates. We are on the DC to RBA, which is, you all may recall, is our federal environmental impact study that looked at a third track between DC and Richmond, and that's the environmental clearance that we're using for our projects associated with the CSX initiative. As part of that environmental process, there's something called the Section 106 process, and that actually is a process to assess historic and cultural resources in the corridor and potential impacts on those, and then to develop a mitigation plan. We are reopening that here in the Richmond area, specifically to look at there is well, first of all, to add FTA to our mitigation memorandum that we have for that, the Federal Transit Administration, but also to look at a new area of effects at the Shockoe Hill Burying Ground Historic District, which is here in downtown Richmond. There's been over the past year or two some new assessment of the boundaries of that district and whether or not our project have a potential impact on that going through that district. So we are reopening that process. We are about to send out some letters to what we call consulting parties, which are interested stakeholders and groups that have a role in that process. And we'll be setting up public meetings this fall. So that is a process we're just beginning. We're also working on our statewide rail plan. We're going to hear a presentation later from Stock about that too. We're coordinating with the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment and their VTrans freight element of that project too. We're still moving forward on several General Assembly studies. We're looking at assessing the cost of the VRE extension, proposed extension to Gainesville, as well as the cost and benefits and feasibility of potentially expanding rail to Bristol, and also an RTC model, an operations model of potential rail stop in Bedford, as well as Amtrak service in the Commonwealth Corridor, which is a potential east-west corridor connecting Hampton Roads to Richmond to Charlottesville and Lynchburg along the Buckingham Branch. So we're in the process of doing those studies right now. More about that in the coming months. I'm sure probably the next meeting you'll hear some more about several of those studies. We are also resuming service on Monday, September 27th to our Route 51, which is our Richmond originating Amtrak route that was canceled due to COVID restrictions. And so Amtrak will be restarting that. That's the last route of Virginia that we have that has not yet been restarted. So we're excited that that's going to resume again on September 27th. So ridership has been good. It's been, well, I should say it's been increasing. July was our highest month in the fiscal year, surprisingly, just as things are starting to open up again. So we have seen a increase. However, we are still we're down about 36% over our normal ridership for this time of year in compared to fiscal year 19. So on the transit side, we have also been increasing ridership on our Virginia Breeze service. We're in the process of launching our new route to Bristol, which is funded through the 81 corridor plan as well. So we expect to launch that in November. The process of working through the procurement on that will be Rhythm. Yes, exactly. So, yeah. Yeah, exactly. The musical heritage. We're continuing to work on our Springfield to Quantico enhanced public transportation study. That's sometimes also referred to as a blue or yellow line extension study, but we're also we're not just looking at metro, we're looking at bus rapid transit and other potential alternatives as well. We're having some public meetings, virtual public meetings, September 21st and 23rd meetings for that project as well. And then finally, we're continuing to work on our transit equity and modernization study. I know you heard the presentation of it to NBTA the other day. So this is a general study that, well, actually, I should say we'll be getting a presentation on this in more detail for grant. So I won't go into too much detail about that, but that we are expecting to have the interim report to the General Assembly in December. So, questions for me? Okay, so with that, I'm going to let Grant get started on our presentation on transit equity and modernization study.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Director Mitchell mentioned, my name is Grant Sparks. I'm the Director of Transit Planning for DRPT, and I am also the project manager for a study that we are embarking on, aimed at identifying opportunities to advance the planning and delivery of equitable transit services. Virginia Transit Equity Modernization Study. We're really excited about this study because equity in the transit industry is becoming more of a hot topic. I think that's been brought on by the pandemic and transit's vital role in transporting essential workers to their workplace. And then also we're excited about this study because the nexus between equity and modernization is something that we don't think anybody else has actually explored. We put out some feelers to our states, and we've done some research, and this isn't really something that anybody else has studied. So we're the pioneers here, and we're really excited to get this started. So quickly, just an outline of what I'll be discussing today. First of all, this is just an introduction study. A lot has happened just in the last 2 weeks of the study. We're really ramping up. So we should have some more detailed information to share next time I come back to you all. But I'll start with just an overview of why we are doing this study and legislation that created this study. I'll walk you through the process that we've developed to implement this study. I'll also expand on some of the topics that we're going to be covering throughout the study development process. Hopefully we have some time at the end for. So first, how did we get here? This past January, House Joint Resolution 542 created the Transit Equity and Modernization Study. And specifically, it said that DRPT needs to complete a needs assessment focusing on the technical delivery of transit services and modernization of transit in the Commonwealth. HJ 542 specifically called out that there needs to be an emphasis placed on transit services and engagement opportunities for underserved and underrepresented communities. So in addition to equity and modernization, the resolution also requires DRPT to explore a wide range of topics. So the focus was really on equity and modernization, but these 6 other topics were mentioned. Those 6 topics being transit, transitability, equity of transit infrastructure, transit electrification, emerging technologies in transit, transit safety, and finally system engagement and governance. So key deliverables that were mentioned in the resolution, as Director Mitchell just said, the interim report is due to the General Assembly this December. And then we're going to be wrapping up with a final report in August of 2020. So HJ 542 passed with a wide range of support from many stakeholders, including Coalition for Smarter Growth, SELC, the Virginia Transit Association, and others. But we quickly, that was great, but we quickly realized that there were a lot of thoughts as to how we should implement this study. So at the very beginning, we had to set some ground rules as to what the study will and will not accomplish. So first, the study will identify transit agency, rider, and stakeholder needs. So understanding the common barriers to achieving modern and equitable transit. This study will also develop an action plan to address those needs. So this won't be something where it's just a legislative requirement and we will check the box. We wanted there to be an action plan associated with this study with actionable items that DRPT.
Finish your thought.
Okay. So this action plan will include both actionable items for DRPT as well as transit agencies and our partners to implement in order to achieve the study goals. Yes, sir.
My question was, recognizing you mentioned we talked about keep deliverables, but at the same time, how forward looking this study look at 10 years, 25 years, 50 years for solutions and recommendations? What are your parameters for outlook in terms of time?
Yes, good question. So the action plan will likely have short-term solutions, mid-term solutions, and then longer-term solutions. I won't get into all the details, but some of these topics are a little bit more complicated than others that are going to take time to implement. Transit electrification is one of them. We won't be able to fully convert the fleet to electric vehicles, in the next couple of years. That's going to take some time. So yes, the action plan will have set, short-term, mid-term, and long-term.
In your action plan, you're looking also to put some numbers to you're looking to do in terms of focus over time.
Yes. It's possible to try to-
Andy to ask if he could work this too.
I know that equitable and modern are words that sound good. On the other hand, what do we mean when we say equitable? There's not a definition, and absent a definition of what we think the desired state is, it's going to be really hard to know. What, do you have a working definition?
So yes, we have created a working definition of both equity and modernization as a study. The caveat being that we anticipate to flush out those definitions as we move through the study process. Specifically, and we'll get into this in a minute, we've assembled a transit equity committee made up of transit agency CEOs, and specifically with the term equity, we hope that they will kind of help guide us as to what that really means.
I just, don't you think that's kind of a limited group?
Yeah.
In terms of where they sit in the chain, the determinants?
Well, they're not going to just define it. We have here, I'll actually read to you what we initially defined as equity. Sure, yeah, and sorry, I should have started off with that. So we have loosely, I guess, defined it at the beginning as the shared and just distribution of benefits and burdens when planning for and delivering transit service. So we're going to be going through some trainings with both transit agencies as well as DRPT staff on really getting into this term equity. It means so many different things to different groups. And so I guess through that process, we're hoping to put, further define what that really means. It's not just going to be, the CEOs of transit determining what equity means in this context. It's going to be DRPT staff, or consultants, the general public as well.
Yeah, I just, having my local governments really struggle with this whole term equity, and people are doing all kinds of trainings all over the place. I think if we can come up with some kind of a definition that is useful. a huge step forward.
Yeah, and maybe for the next presentation, I'll go into the term a little bit more. One of our equity consultants that we're using has a really good graphic that shows the difference between quality, equity, and justice, and how they're all connected, but they're different. Yes, it's important to understand that difference.
Right.
So I'll dive into that a little bit more on the next presentation.
And the connection to V-Trans here is actually an important.
Yes.
So, you know, to the extent that that's something that you might want to take it to the full board, just because I think the board needs to have that conversation as we are moving to that conversation.
And we are also using the V-Trans equity emphasis areas as, you know, a core element of the study. And then back to the definition of equity, our consultant team did a series of 7 focus groups with transit riders last week. We were able to sit in on those kind of behind the one-way mirror, and it was fascinating. And one of the questions that they asked those groups was, what is equity? What does equitable and modern transit mean to you? And so those focus groups just finished up at the end of last week. So we're waiting to get those reports out of the consultants that led those focus groups, but they were fascinating. And so that information is definitely going to help us revise those definitions and really kind of fine tune where we're going.
So the one other thing I would mention, that you were not, but a couple of years ago at the transportation planning board, we asked the question of, if you look at the areas that are identified in a bus map on top of them, what does that tell you? So those layers exist in the MWCOG database in their GIS already. They've done some work sort of looking. So
I think they released a white paper recently
Okay.
on that, and we did get a copy of that.
yeah, and part of the impetus for our questioning was about how do people get their kids to school if the bus service is limited because of COVID and they don't have cars.
Yeah.
So it was partially about.
Yes, very good questions. And then just to follow up on the definition of modernization, as it relates to the study, what we've defined it as is creating a world-class transit network, utilizes industry best practices as it relates to technology, accessibility, infrastructure, safety, and electrification.
Share that world class always makes me cringe. Because it is a very, very high aspiration, and sometimes people feel like it's way too much to get there.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would choose highly functional myself.
Noted, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess transit, when you're looking at the entire globe, our country is a little bit behind.
Oh, we're so far behind.
So yes, very, very good suggestions. Thank you. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish with the study. What we will not be accomplishing with the study, it seemed at the very beginning that there was some thought that we were going to go out and look at every single asset, bus stop, buses, facilities, and do like a conditions analysis. We didn't think that was the best use of our resources. That would take so much time and effort. And we also have some data on asset conditions through our transit database already. So we want to be clear that we will not be doing a new asset inventory, but we will be creating a dialogue with our transit agencies, riders, and the general public to get an understanding of what the conditions are of our assets. And then this last point here, we will not be singling out any transit agencies for poor performance or conditions. This study requires a lot of data and information that we need to collect from our transit agencies. We did not want to cause any unnecessary hesitancy from them to share information with us. So to that end, we will be agency agnostic. I'm trying to just identify key themes across. So this is kind of the study development team. I won't read through this We partnered with Kimley Horn and Associates, so the prime consultant. We have a number of sub-consultants with a wide range of expertise as it relates to those topics that we're going to be exploring. So we've broken the study into 4 phases, and those phases will occur between now and when we submit the final report in August. So we'll start with the data collection phase, and we've actually just wrapped this phase up. Then we'll move into a needs and opportunities assessment. We're just getting started with this right now, the phase 2. This is really where we're going to start to roll up our sleeves and dive into these issues. This phase 2 has a heavy outreach component to it, which I'll kind of go into the details of in a minute. And phase 2 will kind of carry us into the end of this calendar year, where we will start to develop an action plan based on the data that was collected and needs and opportunities that were identified in that phase 2 assessment. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll wrap everything up, creating a final in the spring to be submitted to the Subcommittee. So first, I'll go through each phase just very briefly. This data collection phase, as I mentioned, we just wrapped up. This should give you an idea of the types of information and data that we have collected and reviewed. This is not an exhaustive list. We've looked at way more stuff than this. I'm just going to put it on one slide. But as you can see, the first one, transit development plans and transit strategic plans. These are kind of the foundation of transit planning for each of our transit agencies. So we've collected all of those and reviewed them. Public participation plans, which are often for the agencies required in 6 plan. We've collected all of those. A lot of GIS information and GTFS data. That's the scheduling data for each of our transit agencies. So we know where transit currently exists. Bus stop amenities data. We're looking at capital improvement plans. There are a lot of things that we're looking at here. And really it's data, but it's also plans and protocols and procedures and policies at both the local level as well as the state level. So we're looking at our own policies and procedures as well. So that was phase 1. Now phase 2, the needs and opportunities assessment. On the left here, we have the transit agency engagement activities. So these are activities where we're actually reaching out to our transit agencies across the Commonwealth. And then on the right, we have our public engagement activities. So a lot of these we've already gotten started on. I'll start with the transit agency survey. We've already completed that. We sent out a very comprehensive survey to all of our transit agencies about a month and a half ago, and we got a 100% response rate. So we have a lot of good data to work with from our transit agencies. We've also assembled this transit equity committee that I mentioned earlier. This is the kind of like an advisory committee for the study, made up of transit CEOs. That group met for the first time last week. They're going to meet 3 more times throughout the study development process. We also have created 4 technical TWGs. We've lumped those 6 topic areas. We've kind of brought them down to 4 technical working groups, and we haven't had any meetings just yet. We're identifying the appropriate individuals to participate in those working groups, but these groups will be transit agency staff, so not executives, as well as industry partners. So this is where we're going to pull in VDOT and some of our other partners across the Commonwealth to really dive into these specific topics. And then DRPT staff consultants will be involved in it as well. Transit equity training, we thought it was important to have some training as part of this study, both for that transit equity committee, so the CEO group, as well as DRPT staff, to kind of get to the point we were talking about earlier as to what is equity, why is it important, what are the challenges with equity. So our consultants are going to help us with that. We're also developing an transit agency outreach kit. So this is just marketing material to help raise awareness of the study. And we're going to be sending that outreach kit to our transit agency so they can help promote it. And then we've already done a few of these, but we have a series of transit agency interviews that we plan to schedule. As we move through this process, there are going to be times where a transit agency will say something and we need to follow up with them and really dive into to that issue. And so we've kind of set aside some time to do some one-on-one interviews with our agencies. And then for public engagement activities, this study doesn't have the traditional, public meetings scheduled. We're taking an approach to public engagement that we're hoping to create a dialogue with them through a virtual environment. So the study website was just went live on Friday. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we put a lot of work into that, and that's just the beginning of the study website. We plan to populate it with rider testimonial videos. We're going to have some story maps, some interactive mapping, and so as the study progresses, we're going to populate that study website. But that's really going to be the key platform. We're going to be dispersing information about the study. We are going to have regular check-ins with stakeholders to update them on the study process, solicit feedback, and just get their thoughts on these key issues that we're going to be exploring. We already have had one stakeholder meeting. We scheduled more. This virtual transit equity and modernization forum, we actually just recently decided to push this to the winter. So this won't be happening in the fall, but this is really the public event where we're going to, it's going to be virtual, and we're going to be trying to create a dialogue with the general public on what is equity, why is it important, kind of bring all these issues to them in a virtual form.
Are you working in an organized way with any groups who are having but not used to participating in all?
Yes, that's a perfect segue to the next one, which is the transit rider focus groups. We thought, so we've assembled 7 focus groups in those meetings, as Jen mentioned earlier. Those focus groups have already met. And we thought, for a statewide transit study, trying to get to the riders is really hard. That's not something that we typically do. It's our transit agencies that connect with the riders. So we wanted to identify groups that speak for the transit riders. So rider advisory councils and other interest groups that, their constituents are transit riders. So we've identified a handful of them. I would say it's not easy doing that. But we've also identified a handful of riders as well. And so on each of these focus groups, I think there's anywhere between 8 to 15 users from different geographies, different backgrounds. We have a mixture of the everyday rider, the occasional rider. We have paratransit riders. We have bus rapid transit riders, and everything. We try to be as diverse as possible.
How about on language?
That's a good one as well. That has already come up as a key issue. And we did have a few of those individuals on our focus groups. Getting back to what does equity mean? We've already figured out that it means something different in every single community. And we were speaking with one transit CEO the other day, where he said in their community, it's the limited English proficiency populations that are the disadvantaged communities. So this is all really good information. We're kind of adapting on the fly. So the study website is now in multiple languages, and we're going to try to get our materials in.
One of the challenges of underserved is that you're trying to find out why people don't thrive, right? And so how do you talk to people who don't?
Yes.
Whether it's, and I do wonder, particularly in my part of the world, it's Spanish speaking, but there are several institutional groups that do speak for them, and they're heavily involved in the Catholic Church. So Catholic Charities might be a partner statewide that could help you figure out, who should we talk to, who are the leaders. So, and I worry, honestly, again, in the world I live in, I worry anytime we're talking about equity and justice, and we're not actively talking about it. I think it's a mistake. So, for what it's worth.
Yes, yeah, these are great suggestions. I know we, on our stakeholder group that we check in with, we have representatives of the based community. And the NAACP is another good one. So,
And LULAC too.
Okay.
Freedom of United Latin Citizens is pretty prevalent in Northern Virginia. I don't know how prevalent they are statewide. There are several, I don't remember the statewide.
okay. Well, yeah, as you have suggestions about groups to engage, please pass those along. We'd be happy to. So yeah, just touched on the focus groups. Those group meetings have already occurred, and we'll likely check back in with them in the spring. We have a comment database. Through the process, we're going to receive tons and tons of comments, so we're trying to track and group them and organize them. And then also we're doing a number of board briefings, including this one, but also going out to our MPOs, as well as our transit agencies and other local and regional organizations to brief them on the study. So phase 3, won't spend a whole lot of time on this one, but just the action plan. This is where the findings from the needs and opportunities assessment will form that action plan. Will include recommendations and strategies that address the barriers by topic. And as mentioned earlier, the plan will describe specific actions, next steps, coordination required. So if there are multiple partners that need to be involved in any sort of action, the timeline for implementation, and the responsible agency. And not on here is any associated costs as well. I do want to draw your attention to the very bottom of the slide. This is very important, and we're trying to get this across to our transit agencies, is that we really anticipate that this action plan that will be developed as part of the study will advise changes to DRPT's funding programs and policies, as well as the development of future plans. So it is critical that our transit agencies are engaged in this process, because we're going to most likely be making some pretty significant changes based on it. And then finally, again, the final report is due to the General Assembly. It will include a summary of the study process and findings, including an executive summary. Two of the key questions that we look to answer, we're going to hopefully answer a bunch of questions throughout the study, but two of the key questions are: what will it take to make the Commonwealth's transit networks both equitable and modern? And then what can DRPT and other partners do to achieve this? So those are kind of the overarching questions that we're going to try to answer. So last slide, I did just want to quickly touch on these 6 topic areas and what we mean by them, and some of the questions within these specific topic areas that we're going to be asking. We already talked about equity and modernization and their definition. Transit accessibility. We have defined it as people's ability to reach goods and services, jobs and activities using transit. So the key questions that we're going to be asking through this specific topic area: where are the gaps in transit service across the Commonwealth versus where are the gaps in transit service supply versus transit demand? And are there disproportionate gaps in transit service across geographies or specific demographic groups? So we're going to be doing a similar approach to V-Trans. We're going to use leverage that's already done on this area. So we're going to just take it a step further to really dive into where those gaps really exist. And then also another topics that we're going to be exploring within the accessibility realm is: what are the impacts of fares on accessibility? Fares do present a significant barrier to many populations. Certainly with the TRIP program, we're exploring zero fare transit, and this is going to also do some work as well, just studying what the impacts are. Adequacy of transit infrastructure. This refers to the general conditions of the existing transit infrastructure and the needs for bringing them up to an acceptable minimum standard. So here we're going to be exploring, among other things, why many bus stops do not have basic pedestrian and ADA amenities, such as our infrastructure, so sidewalks. Yes, it is dollars, yes, but I have a sneaking suspicion that it's more than just funding. It's also coordination, and there are probably some missed opportunities that we're not capturing. There are a number of parties involved in developing sidewalk plans, and so we want to document that as well. And then not just the pedestrian amenities, but also just basic transit amenities like bus shelters, benches, lighting. We want to know what the barriers are to installing that. Moving on to emerging technologies, this is where we are referring to it as innovative technologies and services deployed by transit agencies. So we're going to be asking what technologies are transit agencies currently using, and what are the barriers to deploying even newer, more advanced technologies. Funding again is going to be one of those issues, but also training, one of the issues there. Skilled workforce. Is it the vendors themselves that don't provide good enough training or good products for implementing good technologies in their areas. Transit electrification, this one's kind of self-explanatory, but it refers to the conversion of transit rolling stock to electric propulsion technology. So this is going to be an interesting one. We are asking what it will take to convert the entire statewide fleet to electric vehicles. And so funding is going to be a key part of that, but also in terms of the utility infrastructure, what's needed there. Facility upgrades, that's a huge one. Many of our transit facilities are not equipped with charging technology, so we want to figure out what issues are there. Training, again, our transit workforce is not accustomed to dealing with these advanced vehicles, so what are the needs with that, and also how long realistically will it take to be able to convert the entire. Transit safety refers to the safety of all transit passengers and employees on transit vehicles, at transit facilities and bus stops, and travel to and from transit facilities and bus stops. So one of the key things that we're going to be asking here is, what have we learned from COVID in terms of keeping the passengers and transit employees safe? And then last but not least, system engagement and governance refers to transit agency engagement with the general public, with a particular emphasis on opportunities for disadvantaged populations. So how do agencies define disadvantaged populations? We're going to be asking that. But also, how are these populations represented on transit agency governance? So how are their voices heard at the individual transit agencies in terms of policy creation? So we're going to be digging in. And then with all of these topics, we're going to be trying to understand what the DRPT's role is with respect to improving in these areas. Not just with funding, but again, coordination, training, and other things. So I know that was a lot. I do plan on coming back to you all with an update. Again, we have a lot of information coming in just right now. We're really in the thick of it. So I'm happy to come back as we have more information. Good dialogue. So with that, I'm happy to answer any additional questions that you have.
Questions? Yeah, other than some gaps.
Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. This is a very significant study and initiative for us. We're excited about it, but we'll also inform our programs going forward. So we're excited about that. Yeah, he was at the General Assembly appropriated funds.
We can get 900,000, but we'll probably have to
The current budget is 1.7.
Yeah. It is very short timeline, yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. We expect to spend well beyond the appropriation. Awesome. So for our next presentation, we, at some of our previous meetings, have received a number of questions related to railroad safety. And Jeremy today is going to walk us through the safety framework for railroad safety in Virginia, also national as well. But please, if you have any questions, as Jeremy's brought along. This is it's a complex topic. It's one that, as you'll see, a number of different entities have different responsibilities related to safety. It's different from the transit world, where states have responsibility for safety oversight. So, okay, with that.
And so I will take questions back if you ask me a question about another agency that I don't. So for GRPT for 12 years, now DPRA, I have worked with a lot of these agencies and have a pretty good idea of what they're doing. So even with preparing this presentation. So the map here, you've seen this before, it's from our rail plan, but just going to drive from the point that rail transportation, like interstates, are multi-state interstate commerce. So it's more than just Virginia when it comes to the safety of the railroad. There are a lot of agencies to talk about. There's kind of a web of responsibilities, but we'll go in a certain order here and start with the Federal Railroad Administration because any regulations or enforcement starts there. So Federal Railroad, yes, sir.
If I may, are you going to focus on the difference, if you will, between the freight passenger side?
Yes, I addressed that. First asked question. So, like I said, there are specific mandates on different agencies, and starting with the FRA, in 1966, and they are to promulgate and enforce all safety regulations. Of course, they also issue grants. They have a number of other responsibilities, but their primary purview for rail safety is that they create all the rules, regulations, and they have the enforcement responsibility. So the Office of Railroad Safety has 400 safety inspectors. Virginia, the state corporation program also supplements the inspectors for Virginia. But that enforcement covers these 6 areas of great crossings, hazards, and our operating practices. That means things like when railroad workers are out there and you need to take a cell phone. Moving vehicles, signal and train control tracks over what that means for your team. So the State Corporation Commission, they actually predate the FRA, but today they work in concert with the FRA. Their responsibilities are not additive. So their delegated responsibility, they have 11 inspectors that are certified by the FRA for investigating and doing surveillance, but they do not have enforcement. So they will do their work and give it to the FRA for enforcement. The railroad regulation section, so there's a lady named Renee Salmon that we work very closely with the SEC. So they'll investigate block rail crossings. If I was just watching a 2-mile long train at a station, that's going to block the crossing. Somewhere. A lot of times DRPT will get the call. There's going to be an investigation. SEC does that. So we a lot of times facilitate that conversation. They receive claims and they, like I said, do their inspections and FRA enforcement activity. And then I'll go over the speed here. So the National Transportation Safety Board, they investigate every civil aviation incident. But when it comes to other modes, they have some discretion. And so if they come in on a major incident, they feel they need to do it. So their main thing is and recommend making regulations, which still would be implemented by the FRA. But yes, if they show up to investigate, FRA and SEC. So that kind of covers federal regulations and enforcement. And how the state runs the state corporation. Then we also have the highway rail grade crossing, or state roadway rail crossing programs. It's not just grade crossing, but also separated. And then there's also private crossings, so you have public and grading, separated private crossings. About 5,500 crossings. A lot of crossings, a lot of touch points between roadway and rail. About that 2.5 mile long train on its way through all the little communities, Ashland, everywhere in Virginia. So that program is a program that funds improvements at the touch points of road and rail. It's through the Federal Highway Administration, PDOT, called the 130 program short. They'll install protective devices. Those can be passive or active. So active, you can see red lights flashing, your arms are coming down, or passive is letting you know crossing your head. They'll fund things to remove hazards. So if there are sightline issues, sometimes putting a white strip to show people where to stop. That was missing. A private crossing. But the VDOT program FHWA has oversight of VDOT's program for the prioritization of projects and receives funding. And they evaluate the measures that VDOT uses for the safety improvements. There's a new requirement that's currently under development for safety action. VDOT having 130 programs on that. DRT and SCC are involved, and they're identifying high-risk crossings. That is expected to be done in December. I believe that is required to be done by the further days. And then when Emily talks about the rail plans, there's a lot of changes on the horizon for railroads in Virginia. So this map, we kind of overlaid some of this map from our rail plan for whole duration of rail. It shows what Virginia will own. So there's some differences here between host railroads. Right. So the host freight railroads, they have to meet FRA. They have to maintain the tracks per plan. FRA. They've been inspected all the time. Some of them are plans, some of them are surprise inspections. They have to respond to incidents on their railroad. They have to protect their workers. So, and they take liability for the operations, which is very important. Amtrak. We have 2 Class 1 freight railroads in Virginia, CSX and Norfolk Southern. They host the majority of Amtrak service. I'll cover Buckingham Branch in a minute. They also host some Amtrak service, but predominantly our Amtrak service goes over CSX and Norfolk Southern freight carriers, 9 short line railroads. So as we're taking over certain parts of the state's rail corridors, creating passenger rail authority, the agreements were designed so that the passenger rail authority is not a railroad and that it owns assets and it's now a railroad. We own assets, we're not a railroad. It's called state of main transaction. It's a common carrier obligation that freight railroads will maintain. But also we're not an operator, so we have an Amtrak here we are. So I'll cover that in just a minute. Our compete order, DC, CSX is going to maintain the railroad while we're in this first 2 phases working towards separation. They have to maintain it against FRA standards. And then after separation, the VPRA is going to have the right to contract that out. And Amtrak is the first right of refusal on that for the first 2 years of separation. Another segment of the Transforming Rail Initiative, the S line, it's called segment 2. It's currently abandoned. There's nothing out there operating rail right now. It's just a right of way. We have the right to contract an asset. And then the Doswell Clifton Ford, which is the branch railroad, they will maintain the railroad FRA safety standards. Continue their existing contract. Department service. A portion of the line that Virginia. And then we also have the Virginia line, which is Norfolk Southern railroad. And we have over the assets that we talked passenger rail. Very and Amtrak. Amtrak has to meet FRA safety requirements to provide service. Having been in operation since the 70s, sure DJ probably speaks to this in more detail, but they're sometimes they have certain rights. They're created by the federal government to operate overfreight lines. They have to meet FRA requirements, and they provide a system safety plan on behalf of state sponsors. So in state sponsoring Amtrak service, Amtrak is working with providing that system safety. That's something that they want to do for their state partners, because there's 17 partners and they don't want a bunch of different plans to have to implement. So Virginia has delegated that responsibility. So this third bullet point here under Amtrak consultant is pretty correct. Amtrak assumes liability for incidents not something on somebody at the stations. That's a little bit different than Virginia Railway Express. It has to meet FRA safety requirements as well. They have to maintain a system safety plan as well. But they assume responsibility for any losses or claims that arise in their operations. I'm going to stop there with the wording, but you can see the differences. It's more broad for the RV and practice.
You know, why those two different.
I believe, well, Amtrak having been. So the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority and DRPT. Like I mentioned earlier, we're often facilitating, making sure that if a property owner calls us, says somebody cut down a bunch of trees along the right of way and landed in my yard, make sure they get to the right road. There's an incident at crossing, a lot of times people come back, make sure we follow the right agencies. There's a lot of incidents that come our way, and we all play a facilitating role. When we write our funding agreements, they require that improvements are built in. And we talked about this a bit with the freight program, but we also value the safety of mode of operation, moving materials and people. So when we're evaluating the cost analysis, that comes with savings and all of that. The BPRA maintenance assignment is being held to the FRA standards. It affects safety, but also it affects speed and reliability. So you'll hear the best say the term sometimes, but FRA tracks safety standards. So you maintain to a certain standard. So DC to Richmond corridor, it is maintained to class 4, which allows you to operate up to 79 miles an hour passenger. But each class has different speeds. Difference going around curves and things like that. But, so reliability is super. I also wanted to mention that because a lot of our employees go out there for projects, to see work that's done. We don't inspect for safety, we inspect for what we're paying for. But we do take training, railroad worker safety training. There's a lot to think about here on a railroad, a lot of distractions, and it needs to be a very unsafe environment. Some safety before you step foot into that. And the BPRA owning right of way, we also took on some stations. And there's a safety element there that we have to and ensure compliance with that. So we are already planning on some. And then I just wanted to mention that one of the unique things was you might say, well, BPRA and DRPT really don't have much to do with safety. But actually, I mean, our role is very unique. Aside from facilitation, we're investing for multimodal solutions, transit. So our role is actually very unique because we're investing in the infrastructure, investing in the operations that operate across this entire network. One item I do want to mention, and your 10 minutes here, I know you work a lot on the safety, but DRPT does have on the transit side state safety oversight responsibility. 1996.
originally, but then updated in 2016. Actually, it was even a year before that, but the final rules were promulgated in 2016. That really delegates safety oversight to the states for transit rail systems.
And so the Modern Metro Rail, state compact, there's set up to be the state safety oversight. That's the system. But I just wanted to end on a couple of notes something that you should be aware of. What you can do as a private citizen for rail safety, always expect to train at any time, on any track, in any direction. I mean, there's been a lot of incidents where you have two tracks, a car track, with the train going this way, so you get mesmerized, you don't see the train coming this way. And that happens at stations too. So always expect to train. And then the other thing I want to mention, you might have seen YouTube videos on this sort of thing, but when there is a crossing incident, somebody's stuck on the tracks, and you've seen instances where a train plows into a truck that was stuck on the track or something. At every public crossing, there's a blue sign that has a 1-800 number to call that will go directly to dispatch and tell them the number on that crossing that will shut the network down. And so that's something that you can do if you see somebody stuck on the tracks. Find that little blue sign. So that was the end of the presentation. See if there's any questions. Cover everything. Any questions now?
Yeah, that was interesting.
I was thinking the same thing.
So we're talking about innovation.
So one of my questions is, annually, you sort of the safety incidents. What happens in routine on the network? Even though we may doesn't have solving all these problems. But because on
We have not been doing that, but that's actually a very good suggestion to work with VDOT on that as well. The VDOT has been tracking anything related specific, I don't know if Jeremy, they've tracked anything related to reed crossings.
So where I would start is where I would go to the SEC and see what reports are out. They do maintain a lot of records, FRA maintain records, so there may be a report out that we could start on.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we talk about kind of more freight on the rail system, doing that, some way to track, if traffic increases, are we also seeing increasing incidents or not? I mean, it's kind of a message about the use of it.
And I do believe the 130 program does do a review. That's probably one of the elements that I know, like, right, program where they have looked at incidents and then they go and hone in on that crossing.
Right.
That helps. That's one of the ways they prioritize it.
Well, and again, I think it's all just a way to talk about the reliability, one of our most, lives are lost, hours lost, all of it.
And do we track any information about hazardous cargoes such as oil or basic hazardous cargoes that are moving on the rail? Certainly, I know in the shipping world, we track TEUs, which is a 20-foot container, and everything around the world is based on that system. I recognize from the northern Midwest down to Oklahoma and all the way down into Texas, there's a tremendous amount of rail traffic moving oil. And I don't know what we have moving generally in the state. I don't know what might be anticipated.
Yeah, I think I would start with FRA there, because they have review over hazardous materials and regulations related to that. Do they have reports? There's sometimes data that they don't publicly share. You have to sign agreements. And I know railroads in the past, when we've asked for tracking, there, for many reasons, they're protected. But I'll check.
as I understand it as well, they, I believe are also required to notify law enforcement and they have particularly hazardous materials that are in through a jurisdiction. But it's, I'm not sure what the threshold is exactly what's considered, when they have to notify a jurisdiction for something that's particularly hazardous, but I do know that they have some. There wasn't a examination done back in 2015, 2016 after the number incident, and the state was actually led by Aubrey at the time, as well as Brian Moran, Secretary for Public Safety, did a review of rail safety in the state responsibilities as well. So I haven't seen that one out there.
Yes, and I do remember the conversation. There is that coordination with local hazmat and law enforcement. But we do get occasionally. One of the members of Congress that a dump truck on the Buckingham branch. We've been given a heads up that there's a range on the through. Yeah. So, maybe also
Excellent work. Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy. So next we, Emily Stock is going to talk to us about the state rail plan. Not your last presentation on state rail plan. We're in the process of updating. I think we've given you all a brief overview earlier, but Emily's going to go into some more detail about the components of the plan, and particularly some of the policies that we'll be updating. I think many of which we talked about in this, but we'll be updating to our rail plan.
Thanks, Jennifer. And just to follow up with the presentation you just heard, the rail plan does monitor safety. Every 4 years. We get data from FRA and other sources, and we do measure the number of incidents, and we do look at the differences with safety compared to other modes. So that's something that we're working on as well.
And I've been here 5 years, so we get
we transmit data to Boise, and it's something that I know DRPT would like to see highlighted more.
Yeah.
And we can do that. Usually it's something that's in the weeds in the rail plan, and it's something that we can be highlighting more, I think, in the future.
You know, one of my concerns about the trans is there's a lot of stuff. There is a lot of stuff. I would love it if we could figure out there are, 2 major measures or 2 things that we care about that would be regular, that would at least get an annual, so that we have a sense of the larger arc of our work. That lost for us, and it's a lot. So, and this is one of those things. Safety is one of those things. I just think it's really important.
And that's what this is all about. So I'll be talking today a little bit about the plan structure, the executive summary that we have, and the way that we're reporting information that FRA requires. As Jennifer mentioned, some information about policy recommendations, and then wanted to talk with you all also about and some of the data that we're working closely with Boise on. And specifically, I know Amtrak passenger, that you're not seeing that on the agenda here, and that's because we just recently got our complete OEB data from from Amtrak origin destination data. And so we're churning through those numbers and we'll have more for you there. So our plan development process, we had some initial scoping and visioning meetings back in May, and I presented to this group earlier at the start of that process. Right now, we're working on a draft project list, gathering information from railroads, and also putting together our project list from Transforming Rail in Virginia as well, breaking that down. And as we go ahead, we'll be looking at both freight and passenger data and doing a service development plan in the winter, and that will help to filter some of the priorities that we have in the project list. And then we expect to adopt our plan in spring of 2022. And we've done a couple of surveys so far. We did a Commonwealth Corridor survey, and the Commonwealth Corridor is a study that is General Assembly asked for, and that's going to be included in the rail.
And that's the budget.
That is
Oswald.
Well, it would connect Hampton Roads, Richmond, Charlottesville, down to Lynchburg and the New River Valley.
We need help on these new terms.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Commonwealth Corridor. So of course, our plan aligns with the goals and objectives of V-Trans. We work very closely with Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment. We adopt a new rail plan every 4 years. Our last one was adopted by the CTB in 2018. And the FRA has very defined requirements for rail plans. And usually they're very long documents with a lot of data to sift through. But they're necessary. To apply for federal funding and receive federal funding. We will be doing a 4-year and 20-year project horizon list. And of course, our data points that we collect and report are data points that can be compared year to year, state to state, which is helpful as we build our rail program. And of course, we are going to be and we continue to coordinate very closely with passenger rail.
And then we'll just the time check.
Okay. So as I mentioned, we coordinate very closely with V-Trans. And I want to mention the V-Trans freight element. So V-Trans freight element is something that is a study that's going on right now. You may have heard about it at the larger CTB meetings. And they're developing data that is similar to what we're looking at in the rail plan for freight. And so we've coordinated with them. Their data comes from the same sources that our rail plan data is. And we're building on that in our plan so that we can not just look at the raw data, but also ground truth it. And so part of the role that we see for the team is to do some outreach to shippers, to industry, to the port, find out if some of the trends that have been identified through the V-Trans process are trends that they're seeing on the ground. And we do have a freight advisory committee that is also helping with this freight element, and it's made up of private sector partners. So we're going to be doing some outreach to that group as well with the data that comes from V-Trans and the freight element, and that we're working with and rail plan too, and really coming in on the freight rail aspects of that. So rail plan structure, we always do a rail system overview, look at existing conditions, talk about how we plan for rail, and then look at some of the differences between what happened in 2018, what's happening now, forecasts, and then of course the service gap analysis is part of our service development plan. As we vet project lists and think of solutions, we want to make sure that we are covering those gaps in service that we've identified through the service development plan. And then, of course, the outcome is this project list that will make sure to document benefits and project impact.
So Emily, will the first thing we heard about today, the equity and modernization study, studies like into that were those things.
So vision goals and objectives, that the equity piece, and we're very aligned with what V-Trans is doing, and that's what one of the goals of V-Trans, and so that's where I see it fitting in, and then I also would like to though partner with transit and really see what they're finding on the ground. They're doing so much new research that we don't have. So I'd like to be able to use as much of that as I can too, that's specific to transit and also related to rail in that lineup. So I would like to build on that, but that's where I see it